Objective 4. Construct frequency and relative frequency ogives. Now we introduce another graph called the ogive. An ogive, read as ogive, is a graph that represents the cumulative frequency or cumulative relative frequency for the class. It is constructed by plotting points whose x-coordinates are the upper class limits and whose y-coordinates are the cumulative frequencies or cumulative relative frequencies of the class. Then line segments are drawn connecting the consecutive points. An additional line segment is drawn connecting the first point to the horizontal axis at a location representing the upper limit of the class that would precede the first class if it existed. Okay, so now we're looking at the upper class limits. So the upper class limits is what we're focusing on, which are these ones here. Okay, and so again, we want to look at, okay, what would be the upper class of the previous one? Well, the previous one, the upper class limit would be 7.99. Okay, and likewise, the upper class limit for the next one would be 20.99. Okay, now down below here, a relative frequency ogive is drawn by plotting points whose x-coordinates are the upper class limit of each class. So let's take a look at that here. These represent the upper class limits from 7.99 all the way to 19.99. Okay, and then the y-coordinates are the cumulative relative frequencies of each class. So it's either the cumulative frequency or the relative frequency. Okay, in this one we're going to be doing the cumulative relative frequency, so we're going from 0 all the way to 1. Okay, so then what we would do is then connect the points with the line segments. So we're going to first start with 7.99, and that means that it's going to have a cumulative relative frequency of 0 because we don't have a number for that, so that's going to be located right here. And then for 8.99, we're going to round this to 2 decimal places, which is 0.05, so there is 0.05. Okay, and then for 9.99, the cumulative frequency is 0.1. Okay, and then for 10.99, the cumulative frequency is 0.2. For 11.99, the cumulative frequency is 0.225, which is about 0.23. And then for 12.99, we have 0.38. For 13.99, we have 0.7. For 14.99, we have 0.88, so about 0.88. For 15.99, we have 0.95. For 16.99, we have 0.975. For 17.99, we have also 0.975. And the same for 18.99. And let me make sure that this is where it needs to be. So again, for 15.99, we have 0.95. For 16.99, we have 0.975. For 17.99, we have 0.975. For 18.99, we have 0.975. And then for 19.99, we have 1. So again, connecting the dots is going to give us our graph. And again, this represents the cumulative frequency. Okay, so an additional line segment is drawn connecting the first point to the horizontal axis at a location representing the upper limit of the class that would precede the first class if it existed. Now notice how 20% of the mutual funds had a 5-year rate of return less than or equal to 10.99%. Ogives do not have a line segment drawn from the last point to the horizontal axis because ogives represent the number or proportion of observations less than or equal to the x-coordinate of the point. Note that the height of the last point in a relative frequency ogive is always 1. Okay, now let's go ahead and construct ogives using StatCrunch. Okay, so kind of similar to what we did previously. Okay, what we're going to do is we want to be able to create a, instead of using midpoints, we're going to be using the upper class limits. So the upper class limits, okay? And so recall that the upper class limits that we're going to use are the ones here that we have here in green. So it's 7.99, and then 8.99, 9.99, 10.99, and then 11.99, 12.99, so we don't need that last one because we didn't need it for our previous one there. And then recall here that we're looking at the cumulative and the cumulative relative frequency distribution. So remember here that we want the cumulative and the relative. So recall that in our other example, we had our cumulative frequency. So we're going to put in here in our title here, cumulative frequency. Okay, and then we also have this title here that represents cumulative relative frequency. So we're going to put in our cumulative frequency. So we have 2, and then 4, we have 8. Let's go back up here. Let's go ahead and continue up here. So we have, 0, and then we have 2, and then for 9.9 we have 4, 10.99 we have 8, and then 9, 15, 28, 35, 38, 39, 39, 39, and then 40. And then for the cumulative frequency, we have 0.05, 0.1, 0.2. Well, actually, again, at the very beginning, we had 7.99, so that represents 0. And then 0.05, 0.1, 0.2, 0.225, 0.375, 0.7, 0.875, 0.95, 0.975, 0.975, 0.975, and then 1. Okay, so now that we have these columns labeled, now we can go ahead and now use StatCrunch to generate these two graphs. So now that we've done that, we're going to select graph, and then we're going to go down to scatter plot. Okay, so in the x variable, we have our upper class limits. For the y variable, since we did the cumulative relative frequency, let's go ahead and put that in there. Okay, and now that we have that, we know where our upper class limits are, and so now we want to display the points, and then we also want to hold the control button down for lines. And then let's label our x-axis label. So we know that our x-axis is the 5-year return. So this is the 5-year return of return, and again that's in percentage. And then the y label is cumulative relative frequency. And now let's go ahead and then graph. And then you can see how our graph represents the one that we have done. Oops. Let's do that again here. Okay, and there's the cumulative frequency. And then if we wanted the relative frequency, we can just come back, the cumulative relative frequency, into StatCrunch. We can come back here, select options, and then select edit. And so we want relative frequency. So we're going to, the cumulative frequency. And so then down here, we're just going to put in the cumulative frequency and then select compute. And then you're going to see, well, how that graph looks. And therefore, there are our two graphs using StatCrunch for cumulative relative frequency and cumulative frequency.